I was watching this argument unfold online the other day. It was one of those comment threads that's impossible to look away from. On one side, you had a guy, you know the type. He was writing these long, very sincere-sounding posts about his own privilege and the deep shame of history. He kept using phrases like, we must atone, and listening and learning. But when someone pressed him on what exactly should be done, his answers got really vague, full of academic language and calls for more awareness. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you had a guy who was just pure anger. His comments were all caps. I'm tired of apologizing for things I didn't do, and we're all just Americans now. Get over it. Any mention of history was living in the past. Any talk of disparity was excuses. The two of them were locked in this perfect, furious feedback loop. One was all guilt. The other was all denial. And what was fascinating, what really struck me, was watching them and realizing that, in a weird way, they were both doing the exact same thing. They were just trying to find a way to feel comfortable. Okay, let's unpack this.
The mission of this deep dive is really to analyze these psychological mechanisms, guilt and denial, that operate as, well, emotional management tools when we talk about racial injustice, and crucially, why they so often seem to prevent actual systemic change. What those two people in that thread shared, it seems, was this underlying desire to just alleviate their own distress.
That's exactly right. And this deep dive, we're going to explore how these psychological strategies, really strategies of emotional convenience, whether it's that guilt-driven atonement or the denial-based colorblindness, how they actively hinder, well, the effectiveness of contemporary social justice discussions. These aren't just random reactions people have.
They feel very patterned.
They are. They're sophisticated, researched coping mechanisms, and they're rooted in the history of racial hierarchy. For us to move beyond these cycles, these defensive loops, we really have to understand the architecture of the feelings themselves.
Okay, so let's start there. Section 1, the foundations of dominant group coping mechanisms. Before we get into how people react, we need to acknowledge the system they are reacting to, right?
Precisely. You have to lay the groundwork. And that groundwork for disparate treatment of racial groups, it stems from a whole sociocultural and historical context, one that places whites as the dominant racial group. Race itself as a concept is really a sociopolitical designation. It underpins these systems of racial oppression, what we call racism.
And that system is what assigns access to things, resources, opportunities.
Exactly. Resources, opportunities, even sort of assumed levels of innocence or trustworthiness based purely on group membership. It's systemic.
And the research we looked at really highlights how this system confers what are called unearned assets, or white privilege. Sometimes it's referred to as conferred dominance.
Yes, and that classic description from Peggy McIntosh, it still holds a lot of weight. That people in the dominant group are often taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, average, and also ideal. It's the default setting, you could say.
Right. The baseline against which others are measured.
And when that deeply internalized, that morally neutral self-image gets challenged maybe by learning about systemic racism or recognizing unearned advantages, the internal conflict, that cognitive dissonance, it's uncomfortable. It can be quite painful, actually.
And that distress triggers these two core emotional responses we see everywhere in public discourse. Guilt, which sort of acknowledges the dissonance.
And denial, which tries to just eliminate it altogether, get rid of the conflict.
Okay, let's start with denial then, because honestly, it often feels like the loudest defense mechanism out there right now. Denial and colorblind racial ideology, or COBRAS, as the researchers call it. This is the posture of that angry commenter, the just get over it guy.
Yeah, colorblindness is incredibly pervasive. It's a deeply embedded coping mechanism. But the key finding from all the research is that, despite the stated goal, usually treating everyone equally, this ideology is actually unrealistic, and it's harmful.
Why unrealistic?
Because racial egalitarianism, true equality, regardless of race, it fundamentally does not exist right now. The evidence for that is just overwhelming. You look at the persistent racial disparities in, say, healthcare access, poverty rates, mental health outcomes. The list goes on. When someone claims to be colorblind, they're actively choosing to ignore a verifiable reality.
So if the reality is undeniable, how does the individual maintain that belief that they are fair, while ignoring all this evidence? The sources we looked at identified two specific psychological processes within COBRAS that let this denial persist.
Right, there are mechanisms at play. The first one is called color evasion. This is the more explicit strategy, denying racial differences by really overemphasizing sameness. It's where you get those classic phrases we hear constantly, I do not see color, or we are all the same underneath, we're all just human.
Trying to skip to the end goal.
Kind of, yeah. Researchers basically categorize this as a largely ineffective but still very persistent attempt to mask internal discomfort when race becomes noticeable, when it becomes salient in an interaction or a discussion.
So it's about managing that immediate awkwardness or discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. But the second process is, I think, far more insidious. It's called power evasion. This is where the individual denies the existence of systemic racism itself.
How does that work?
Well, they minimize racial issues. They might say racism was a problem in the past, but not anymore. They emphasize this idea of presumed equal opportunities for absolutely everyone, and then they attribute any failure or disparity entirely to the individual.
So it's about individual effort or lack thereof?
Right. Lack of effort, poor choices, cultural deficits. Anything but the system. They might argue that racism is not a major issue in the U.S. anymore, and this allows them to defend the existing racial status quo, the way things are, without feeling morally responsible for any inequalities.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly quite counterintuitive.
Yeah.
If someone says they're colorblind because they genuinely want to reduce prejudice, you'd sort of expect their hidden biases, their implicit biases, to maybe decrease over time, but the research found the exact opposite.
That's the crucial finding. Multiple studies found that these colorblindness attitudes were actually more strongly associated with racial bias, even when you measure it indirectly using things like the implicit association test. Let's just pause on that for a second.
Yeah, that's significant.
The very person trying to achieve that temporary emotional relief by denying the relevance of race is actively, maybe unconsciously, reinforcing their own internal racial prejudice. It strongly suggests that colorblindness isn't a path to equality at all. It's really a mechanism of emotional self-protection that ends up solidifying bias.
Wow. So the implication is huge.
Yeah.
The denial mechanism protects the internal self-representation. I'm fair, I'm egalitarian, but it comes at the cost of increasing actual measurable prejudice. It's like an internal trade-off, choosing comfort over reducing bias.
Precisely. It's a way to feel good about oneself in the short term, regardless of the long-term impact.
Okay, now let's pivot to the flip side. Let's talk about the other guy in that opening anecdote, the one steeped in deep shame, calling for atonement, the response of guilt.
Right. White guilt, as it's defined in the literature, is the belief that white people bear some responsibility for harm resulting from historical events, slavery, colonialism, or even current racist treatment and systems. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a positive pro-social awareness, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It sounds like taking responsibility.
But critics, and the research bears some of this out, highlight that when guilt becomes an end in itself, rather than a catalyst for concrete action, it can actually become problematic. It can get stuck.
How so? Stuck in what way?
Well, some critiques, like those from Shelby Steele, for instance, focus on this idea that self-focused guilt can often transform into a kind of form of self-congratulation, especially when it stays abstract and performative.
Performative guilt. Like the listening and learning without action.
Exactly. Individuals might initiate these vague, compassionate policies or use very abstract language, primarily to showcase their innocence to racism. The underlying goal, sometimes unconsciously, becomes reestablishing a good feeling about the self, not actually achieving genuine repair or change for the group that's been harmed.
So the preoccupation with the feeling of guilt centers intensely on the individual's need for redemption of innocence, getting back to feeling morally neutral.
That's a good way to put it. This focus on one's own comfort, on managing one's internal distress, means the individual is primarily seeking to alleviate their personal discomfort. They aren't necessarily translating that emotional awareness into genuine, sustained concern for others, or, importantly, into measurable systemic change.
So, okay, the denial guy and the guilt guy, both locked in that feedback loop online. They're ultimately focused on the same thing underneath it all. Managing their own uncomfortable feelings about race and racism.
That's the convergence point.
And this sets us up perfectly for Section 2, which feels absolutely crucial for separating, productive feelings from what might just be destructive performance. Guilt versus shame and a psychological lever for action.
Yes, this distinction is really the core, I think, of understanding which negative emotional response might lead towards repair and which one tends to lead towards retreat and more defensiveness. Both guilt and shame, they're self-conscious emotions, meaning they are internal evaluations of the self against some kind of standard, internal or external. The critical difference lies in what they target. What aspect of the self is being evaluated?
So if I feel guilt What's the target?
The target is a specific behavior or action. The thought process is, I did a bad thing. Like your example, I broke the dish. It's about the action.
Okay, focus on the action.
And because guilt is attributed to unstable, specific aspects of the self, the action itself, which are seen as fixable, the typical coping response is movement towards others. To repair the damage, apologize, make amends, try to fix the dish. It's generally constructive. The internal monologue is something like, okay, how can I fix this specific situation?
Right. But if I feel shame, that's different.
Very different. With shame, the target is the entire self as defective, as flawed. The thought process shifts to, I am a bad person. Not, I did a bad thing, but I am bad.
So I am the broken dish.
Exactly. That self-indictment is attributed to stable, global aspects of the self, meaning the self is perceived as inherently flawed, maybe even unfixable. Since the whole self feels defective, the coping response isn't repair, it's withdrawal, hiding, avoidance.
Why avoidance?
Because the focus shifts externally. The thought becomes, I must hide so others don't see how defective I am. Shame is often described as far more painful, more debilitating than guilt.
Okay, that distinction is really clear. So applying this framework to racial awareness, when does white guilt actually become pro-social and action-oriented?
Yeah.
How does it move beyond that vague atonement we saw in the comment thread?
Right. Right guilt becomes adaptive, becomes useful when it's linked to internal motivations, we'll come back to that, and when it leads to concrete action. It tends to be triggered when an individual's action, or sometimes critically, their inaction, violates their own personally meaningful internalized values, like a deeply held belief in egalitarianism or fairness.
So it's about a mismatch between my values and reality.
Precisely. And this moves the individual past that global self-indictment of shame, I am bad, and focuses them instead on the action-oriented question. Okay, how can I, someone who genuinely believes in fairness, help remedy the impact of this unfair system? What can I do?
And is there evidence that this type of guilt actually leads to positive outcomes?
Yes, there's strong empirical evidence confirming the adaptiveness of this specific behavior-focused guilt. Research has found that white guilt proneness, a tendency to feel this type of guilt, was strongly associated with confronting white privilege.
Meaning actively engaging with it.
Yes, proactively engaging with and examining one's own unearned advantages. It was also linked to higher levels of white privilege awareness in general, and it positively predicted empathy specifically, feelings of sadness and anger about racism directed outwardly. And crucially, it negatively predicted fear of people of other races.
So adaptive guilt seems to focus on repair and actually reduces the irrational anxiety that often fuels denial.
That's a great summary. It channels the negative feeling into constructive, outward-focused energy.
Okay, now let's look at the flip side again. How does that avoidance response shame work? And why is it potentially so destructive to anti-racist action? This feels like it connects back to the painful self-evaluation that the atonement guy in the comment thread might have been unconsciously experiencing.
It likely does. White shame reflects that negative global self-evaluation regarding one's racial privileges. It's the feeling of, I am bad because I benefit from this system, or I'm inherently flawed because of my race. Because shame is generally experienced as much more painful than guilt, the external focus avoiding exposure becomes paramount.
So the main drive is to not be seen as bad.
Exactly. The response is driven by this deep concern that one's inherent badness will be seen by others, which leads to avoidance behaviors, withdrawal in interracial settings, maybe even silence when dialogue is needed.
What's fascinating and maybe a bit scary is that this profound sense of self-defectiveness can actually boomerang, right? It can lead to increased prejudice. That seems paradoxical.
It does, but the psychological logic holds up. If I feel fundamentally bad or flawed, my primary psychological drive will be to employ defensive mechanisms to protect the self, even if those defenses are ultimately harmful to others or counterproductive to social justice.
How does that play out in the research?
Well, the research suggests that white shame, especially when it's not processed effectively, is associated with a greater risk of future facilitation of racial discrimination. This includes an increased endorsement of things like blatant racism, colorblindness, the really strong denial tactics.
Wow. So trace that psychological journey for us.
Okay, so the feeling of I am bad, shame, is so intensely painful, so threatening to the self-concept, that the individual defensively retreats into the strongest available denial strategies like the power evasion and color evasion we discussed earlier, specifically to eliminate the source of the shame. It confirms that direct link. Self-focused pain often leads to defensive denial.
This really highlights why so many, say, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives might stall out or even backfire. If a mandatory training session inadvertently triggers shame, if the person walks away feeling, okay, I'm inherently racist and bad, their immediate psychological need is likely to avoid or deny the source of that awful feeling.
Right, rather than engage with it constructively.
It reinforces the desire for emotional convenience, for comfort, over genuine, difficult learning.
That retreat is the ultimate psychological move to restore comfort. If the self is perceived as the problem, perhaps the only way to alleviate that deep pain is to stop engaging with the concept of race entirely, to push it away.
Okay, so this transition from self-focused pain-shame towards systemic retreat and denial brings us neatly to Section 3. Now we're looking at the broader, structural, high-level beliefs that fuel and justify that ultimate form of denial.
Exactly. We're moving from the internal emotional management strategies up to the level of external, sort of worldview management. Section 3 covers the systemic defense, and it starts with a really important concept: social dominance orientation, SDO, as a key driver of denial.
Social dominance orientation, what exactly is that?
SDO is defined as a generalized personality variable. It reflects an individual's preference for inequality among social groups. Basically, it's the desire for one's own group, the dominant in-group, to dominate, be superior to, and have disproportionate resources compared to other outgroups. It's essentially a deep-seated belief in and preference for social hierarchy.
Okay, that sounds far more intentional and less like just managing uncomfortable feelings. It sounds like an active preference for inequality.
Yeah.
How does SDO actually manifest in people's political and social attitudes?
Oh, it manifests very powerfully. Individuals who score high in SDO are psychologically driven to maintain inequality. And they often do this by endorsing what social psychologists call hierarchy-enhancing, legitimizing myths.
Hierarchy-enhancing, legitimizing myths. That's a mouthful. What are those?
They're basically the stories, the ideologies, the narratives that societies develop to promote greater social inequality and justify unequal resource allocation. They're the narratives that make the existing hierarchy seem natural, inevitable, or even morally correct.
Can you give us some concrete examples of these myths?
Absolutely. Obvious examples include things like overt anti-Black racism or sexism, but they also include broader concepts like cultural elitism, the belief that certain groups are inherently more cultured, more capable, more intelligent, or just more deserving of success. Believing these myths allows high SDO individuals to rationalize the social disparities they see without ever having to acknowledge systemic injustice or their group's role in it.
So SDO isn't just some vague bias. It's a structured belief system that translates directly into measurable policy positions and worldviews.
It's highly predictive, yes. Research consistently shows SDO correlates positively with supporting punitive legal policies. Think mandatory minimum sentencing, the death penalty, policies emphasizing retribution over rehabilitation. High SDO individuals also tend to strongly favor what are called wars of dominance.
Wars fought for power or resources.
Exactly. Wars fought to ensure economic or geopolitical influence. But interestingly, SDO tends to correlate negatively with support for humanitarian wars. This pattern really confirms that the denial posture often isn't just about emotional ignorance or discomfort. It's frequently rooted in a fundamental desire for group superiority and the active maintenance of that unequal power structure.
And critically, you mentioned SDO correlates negatively with pro-social attitudes.
Yes, negatively with things like concern for others, altruism, empathy, and tolerance. This really underscores that the denial linked to SDO isn't merely defensive, it's often fundamentally non-empathetic at its core. It's a psychological framework basically designed to optimize and justify inequality.
Okay, that framework, that desire for hierarchy, creates a perfect environment for the next concept you wanted to discuss: status threat as a major barrier to progress.
Right. Because if you value hierarchy and your group's place at the top, anything that seems to challenge that position feels deeply threatening. Opposition to social justice efforts today is increasingly understood as being fueled by identity status threat.
Which is what exactly?
It's this deep, almost primal fear that the privileged group, the dominant group, will lose power, influence, and advantage. This fear gets especially potent when demographic shifts are happening, and the group's majority status seems like it might be eroding.
And the perception of loss is key here.
The perceived loss can be even more motivating, psychologically, than the actual material economic situation of the individual. This threat motivates people to try and preserve their own privileged position, and it directly fuels opposition to structural reforms like affirmative action, reparations discussions, or even changes in immigration policy. When you feel your group's social status is under attack, the instinct is to fight back, often in ways that seem irrational from a purely economic standpoint.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the sources pointed out some fascinating examples, like take individuals who are economically disadvantaged within the dominant group, say working class or poor whites. Logically, you might expect them to align politically with other economically disadvantaged groups to push for broad economic reform that would benefit them.
Right, that would be the rational economic self-interest argument. But the research and real-world observations show they may still prioritize maintaining their group's status over their individual or class-based economic self-interest.
Why? What's the draw?
They seem to cling to the symbolic or psychological capital of belonging to the dominant racial group. They might view preserving their ethnic group's composition, its cultural norms, or its traditional position in the social hierarchy as paramount. We see this psychological force being attributed as a factor fueling support for certain nationalist or populist political movements globally, where this sense of group identity and status threat appears to override purely economic considerations.
It's like that old idea of the psychological wage of whiteness, but manifesting as political action driven by status threat.
It's a very relevant connection, yes.
Okay, so the final piece of this Section 3 puzzle is understanding how individual motivation dictates whether someone leans toward that productive guilt pathway or gets stuck in harmful avoidance and shame. This takes us back down to the individual level again.
Exactly. We need to look at the why behind someone's responses. Researchers use tools like the motivation to respond without prejudice scales. These scales help differentiate between two main driving forces when someone is in an interracial setting or discussing race. The first is internal motivation, IMS.
Internal motivation meaning?
This is the desire to act according to your own personal values. The individual genuinely wants to be non-racist because it aligns with their internal self-concept, their ethical standards, who they believe they are or should be. It comes from within.
Okay, and the second type?
The second is external motivation, EMS. High EMS reflects the desire to appear non-prejudiced, primarily to avoid external disapproval, to avoid social sanctions, being called racist, facing backlash, maybe losing social standing, or even professional opportunities. The motivation here is outward-focused, driven by fear of the social cost.
So this is the difference between genuinely wanting to change your behavior because you believe it's the right thing to do, IMS, versus maybe writing a very careful performative social media post because you're afraid of being canceled or criticized, EMS.
That's a perfect illustration of the difference. And the research confirms that these two distinct motivations tend to lead down fundamentally different paths in terms of outcomes. High IMS, that internal drive, is linked to approach behaviors wanting to engage, learn, understand. It predicts more positive interracial interactions, and it strongly correlates with the constructive, adaptive type of white guilt we discussed. It leads towards engagement.
Whereas high EMS?
High EMS, the external fear-driven motivation, is linked to avoidance behaviors. Increased anxiety in interracial settings, negative expectations about interactions, and it strongly correlates with the hallmarks of the shame response withdrawal defensiveness.
And does the data link guilt specifically to internal motivation?
Yes. The empirical evidence confirms this link quite clearly. White guilt was found to be positively predictive of internal motivation. This really solidifies the idea that genuine adaptive guilt is rooted in a motivation to align one's actions with internal ethical standards, making it much more adaptive for sustained anti-racist action compared to shame-driven avoidance, which is often linked to external pressures.
Okay, that detailed psychological groundwork really shows us why people get trapped in that furious feedback loop we started with. Denial protects the self by ignoring the problem. Shame protects the self by focusing inward and withdrawing. Guilt, when it's adaptive, actually focuses outward on repair.
Well put.
Now let's move to Section 4, where researchers have tried to synthesize these complex emotional forces into more concrete profiles that actually predict behavior and attitudes.
Right. This is where researchers develop tools like the Psychosocial Cost of Racism for White Scale, or PCRW. This scale was designed to assess the different affective or emotional costs of racism, specifically for white individuals. It measures dimensions like white guilt, white fear, often irrational fear of people of other races, and white empathy, sadness or anger about racism.
And they combine these.
Yes, by combining these three emotional dimensions using statistical methods like cluster analysis, they were able to identify distinct emotional profiles. Think of them as common combinations of these feelings. And these profiles, interestingly, predict specific attitudes and behaviors towards social justice efforts like affirmative action or diversity initiatives.
So it's like saying your particular emotional cocktail determines your likely actions and beliefs on these issues. What were the key clusters, the main profiles they identified?
Okay, the first one they identified, which was actually the least common in their samples, is called the anti-racist type. This group shows the most adaptive combination of emotions. They have high guilt, high empathy, and crucially, low fear.
The ideal combo, it sounds like.
It seems to be. They represent the highest levels of support for policies like affirmative action and promoting racial diversity. For this group, it appears that guilt and empathy work together to fuel action, and the low level of fear allows them to engage constructively without that defensive retreat kicking in.
Okay, but if that's the ideal type, and it's the least frequent, what's the most prevalent group they found?
That dubious honor goes to the empathic but unaccountable type. This group profile is characterized by high empathy, but low guilt and also low fear.
High empathy, low guilt, low fear. What does that look like?
Well, these individuals are willing to acknowledge the suffering of others. They can feel sadness or concern about racism. They are empathetic observers. However, because their guilt levels are low, they tend to lack that critical awareness of their own racial privilege and, importantly, a sense of personal or collective responsibility needed to translate that empathy into meaningful action.
So they feel bad for the person experiencing racism, but they don't necessarily feel responsible for the system causing it or obligated to change it.
That's a very accurate way to describe it. It sounds incredibly comfortable, doesn't it? You get to feel morally decent because you're empathetic, but you perceive no personal obligation to change your own behavior, question your advantages, or advocate for systemic change that might require some sacrifice. This type, you can imagine, is probably very prone to those vague awareness calls or just expressing sympathy without tangible action.
Yeah, it feels like the path of least resistance emotionally. You mentioned thoughts and prayers earlier.
It has that quality, yes.
Yeah.
It's empathy without accountability.
Then we have the third significant group identified, which is the fearful guilt type. This group presents a really conflicted profile. They show high guilt and high irrational fear of people of other races, coupled with only moderate levels of empathy.
Okay, so the awareness of injustice is there. They feel the guilt, but the high level of fear acts like a psychological brake preventing action. That's the perfect analogy. Their awareness of privilege, their sense of responsibility, the guilt, it gets completely counteracted, maybe even paralyzed by this high level of irrational fear or anxiety about interracial interaction or potential conflict. The result. This group actually shows higher levels of colorblind attitudes, retreating into denial, and significantly less support for policies like affirmative action compared to the anti-racist type.
Even though they have high guilt.
Even though they have high guilt. The internal distress caused by the combination of guilt plus fear seems to be so high, so uncomfortable, that they resort to denial strategies like colorblindness just to manage the anxiety, even if, on some conceptual level, they know that injustice exists.
Wow. This mechanism, high emotional distress leading immediately to defensive denial, brings us directly back to that concept that seems to tie so much of this together: white fragility.
Yes, absolutely. The difficulty that some individuals have in maintaining these intense affective states, whether it's adaptive built or even necessary uncomfortable shame, especially when they're confronted directly with their privilege or complicity in racist systems, this difficulty contributes directly to the phenomenon Robin DiAngelo termed white fragility.
Which is defined how? Again.
Sociologists generally define it as an inability to tolerate racial stress. And this inability often stems from the underlying, often unexamined expectation of racial comfort that's afforded by being part of the dominant group. It's like the emotional thermostat is set very low for discomfort.
It's an internal reaction of, this is too uncomfortable, I can't handle this, make it stop. And when this fragility gets triggered by even what might seem like minimal racial stress, say, being told a comment was insensitive, being asked to consider reparations, or even just reading about racial disparities, the defenses kick in almost immediately.
Exactly. And those defenses manifest as the behaviors we've discussed: withdrawal, maybe becoming silent, perhaps getting argumentative or defensive, crying, changing the subject. Because the individual lacks what DiAngelo calls the racial stamina to effectively engage with the topic without feeling personally attacked or overwhelmed.
And it becomes a self-serving loop. Right? The stress causes them to employ these cognitive processing strategies like aggressive colorblindness, maybe defensive shame disguised as exaggerated guilt, specifically designed to protect their internal self-representation, to get back to feeling fair, just, and egalitarian.
That's the protective function, and the ultimate outcome is often a stagnation in racial identity development. The person might gain some awareness, which increases their emotional distress, but then the coping mechanisms kick in to protect their comfort zone. This cycle ultimately perpetuates the very attitudes and systems they might verbally oppose, because they can't stick with the discomfort long enough to actually internalize the learning and change.
And the ability to even employ a race-neutral, colorblind stance in these moments is fundamentally a function of white privilege itself, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It allows the individual to unilaterally choose when and how to pay attention to racism. They can opt out when it gets too uncomfortable. This insulates them from the necessary, sustained, effective engagement, sitting with the discomfort, the guilt, maybe even the shame that would likely be required for genuine internal shifts and meaningful systemic change. It's a privilege of emotional choice, enabled by structural advantage often used for emotional avoidance.
Okay, so bringing this all together, this deep dive really shows that the furious feedback loop I described at the very beginning, the guy lost in abstract guilt versus the guy locked in angry denial, it's actually less about ethics or political positions, fundamentally, and much more about emotional management. In both cases, the dominant group member is trying to establish and maintain a level of psychological comfort.
That's the core insight that emerges, I think. Both the performative guilt that doesn't lead to action and the outright denial that defends the status quo seem to be driven by the same underlying desire: to alleviate internal distress when confronted with the reality of racial inequality. Denial eliminates the distress by pretending the issue doesn't exist or isn't significant. Shame and self-focused guilt are attempts to manage the distress once the issue is acknowledged, but they often fail to produce change because they keep the focus on the self, how do I feel, rather than on the impact on others or the needed repairs.
And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to that guilt versus shame distinction. True transformation, actual movement towards equity, doesn't seem to come from guilt that just leads to vague calls for awareness, which, as we've unpacked, is often just unprocessed shame dressed up as atonement, a way to feel virtuous without acting.
Right, nor does it come from the simple denial that just defends the way things are.
Instead, it comes from that very specific psychological mechanism, adaptive guilt, that focuses on behavior. What systems am I part of? What can I do differently? Coupled with that internal motivation, we talked about the genuine desire to make amends and align actions with values.
Exactly. The ability to move past the paralyzing "I am bad" of shame into the motivating "I did a bad thing," or perhaps more accurately, "I benefit from a bad system and my inaction contributes to it." Guilt. That shift seems directly tied to repair, to responsibility, and to movement towards others and towards solutions. The inability to move past shame forces withdrawal and fuels denial.
So maybe the ultimate lesson here is that we need to be able to talk about white shame more explicitly, not ignore it, not invalidate it by immediately trying to reframe it as productive guilt, but acknowledge it.
That's a powerful point raised by some scholars. Acknowledging shame honestly might be necessary. As one scholar put it, shame embodies conceptions of what one is and how one is related to others. Until that painful self-evaluation happens honestly, and perhaps is processed constructively, the tendency to retreat into denial or into self-focused performative guilt will likely persist. And that severely hinders the capacity for genuine other-oriented empathy and sustained systemic action.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? It seems the most potent barrier to achieving racial equality isn't just overt prejudice, the explicit racism we can easily condemn. It might actually be the pervasive desire for racial comfort itself within the dominant group. That desire triggers defensiveness and avoidance, regardless of whether that defense manifests as self-congratulatory, performative guilt, or as outright angry denial. Both roads lead away from change.
And the sources really highlight that final point. Awareness of racism and privilege, when it inevitably leads to emotional distress for those who benefit from the system, often results in the immediate employment of these cognitive processing strategies like color blindness, like minimization, like focusing on intent over impact strategies specifically designed to protect the internal representation of oneself as fair, just, and egalitarian, prioritizing feeling good over doing good, essentially.